Hello and welcome to a short video which is guaranteed to get you up into grades 7, 8 and 9 for your understanding of Eric. I'll take you through the traditional interpretation that gets you kind of grades 4, 5, 6 and a bit of 7, but then I'm going to give you some alternatives which you'll see here. We'll look at the importance of his drunkenness, then at the whole idea of capitalism and theft. We will look again in more detail at what his drunkenness means about his future actions, and then we'll consider how Priestley uses Eric to examine the First World War. That's it. Let's get going. So you're used to studying Eric, I imagine, as a symbol of the younger generation who act differently to their parents and are going to change the world. And you can use typical quotation like this one at the end. Well, I don't blame you, but don't forget, I'm ashamed of you as well. Yes, both of you, is what he says to his parents, and it sounds like he's going to grow up to be completely different to them. Okay, but now you want an alternative interpretation because that's where the top grades are. Here we go. Let's examine Eric in a bit more detail. He takes no responsibility for his own actions. Let's see what I mean here. Well, he forces himself on Eva. In the modern day, this would be a crime. But he claims he has no memory of what happened. He says only that it seems, in other words, I don't remember, this is what she must have told me afterwards, which sounds like a lie. It seems he behaved badly. In that state in which a chap turns nasty. Well, notice how he distances himself from what he's actually done by refusing to use the personal pronoun I. He doesn't say, it seems I was in a state where I turned nasty because I was drunk. No, he says a chap, as though it's almost not really him. And anyway, if it is him, well, all chaps behave this way, don't they? Well, you can see how cynical that is, but also what an easy way for him not to take responsibility for forcing himself on Eva. So actually, he is not an honourable person to be trusted. So yes, he says this, but do we believe that he will change his behaviour? Yes, I'll believe somebody changes behaviour if they express regret. But actually, when we look at his words, he seems to be deflecting the blame, not accepting responsibility. Then he commits the only other crime in the play. So he steals money from his father's business. But when he's accused of stealing, he confesses to having taken the money, but he denies that it's theft. So when his father says, "You stole the money," he replies, "Not really," because he claims he intended to pay it back. Well, that's a ridiculous argument, and it's only an argument someone can make if they refuse to take responsibility for their actions. So again, this is Priestley's way of showing us that we should not trust Eric's words, because when it comes down to his actions, he does not take responsibility for what he's doing. Well, why does Priestley present Eric in this way? Well, Eric is a symbol of the future of capitalism, the future at least as far as 1912 is concerned. So he's trying to get hold of the idea that capitalism is theft. And I'll explain what I mean here. In order for certain members of society to get incredibly rich, they have to make lots of people work for them for a lot less money than they get themselves. And typically what happens is they create a company, that business earns loads of money, and instead of giving that money equally out to the workers or fairly out to the workers, they don't. They pay the workers as little as possible in order to get as much profit as possible, and they keep that profit for themselves. That is what capitalism does. So it's really a form of stealing from the people who work for the business, because they're the ones who put in the effort to make the profit, but the profit does not go to them. That's Priestley's view. So this refusal on Eric's part to accept responsibility is made worse by the amount he steals. So we've got a problem in the modern day of thinking, well, £50, what's that? Well, in that day, it's well over 40 weeks of earnings which Sheila would have received at Burling's. You remember that she went on strike hoping to get, I think it was 25 shillings a week, and she earns 23 and a bit. So what we can see is that actually £50 would have been about 40 weeks worth of earnings. Well, they've only been together for about 16 weeks. So he claims he's given all this money to Eva, but that's rather impossible, isn't it? Unless she's starting to spend 3 times as much as she did when she had a job. Well, this is highly unlikely. And what's much more likely is that he's kept most of this money for himself, for his own drinking, and he's just not confessing that to us. Now, the audience in 1945 would have been attuned to this figure being much greater than the wages that Sheila was being paid a year, and so they would see this quite clearly as a barefaced lie. There is a big problem with the amount that he's stolen and claiming that it was just for Eva. Well, it isn't. It's mainly, or at least significantly, for himself. And that's what Priestley is saying capitalists are. They're in it for themselves, and worse than that, they'll lie to themselves that they're actually doing things for the benefit of others. As he says he's doing it, Eric says he's doing it for the benefit of Eva, but it's a lie. Yes, it partly benefits her, but it much more benefits him. So he's clearly kept most of that money, and therefore Eric personifies capitalism as theft. I've put that in bold and white so that you can use that phrase in your essays. And therefore the rich are thieves. Now there is another reason for Eric agreeing with the inspector and attacking his parents' views, and this is because he is a symbol of upper class drunkenness. Yes, he's drunk, but look at how much alcohol is consumed during the play. It all starts with the ritual of upper class drinking past the port Edna. That starts right at the beginning of the play. And one of Priestley's points is the upper classes use alcohol constantly, every night with every meal. It's just something that they do. Another way of examining that is to suggest that capitalism is linked to greed, not just for money, but also food and drink. And he's also questioning the logic of capitalist thinking. Are they making all these decisions, like Eric is, when they're drunk? We know that Eric is drunk because he's squiffy at the beginning of the evening, which means drunk, but he's had far more to drink since, and in particular, when he comes back in Act 3, Burling doesn't want to give him any more drink because he's already drunk, but the inspector insists and gives him a lot more brandy. So when he starts protesting against his parents, he's absolutely drunk. And now that has to have a really big impact. And if you're lucky enough to see this play in performance, especially if you see the National Theatre production, you'll see that Eric is presented as, well, in the modern day, blind drunk, legless in fact. So that's an interpretation you can bring to his apparent siding with the inspector and apparently learning the inspector's lesson. Well, he probably won't even remember it when he wakes up the next day because he's so drunk. And this is another reason that Eva's second death occurs. So remember, Eva's second death is a symbol for the Second World War. So the first death was a symbol of the First World War. Society was supposed to learn its lesson. That First World War was so horrific, it was named the war to end all wars. And yet, just 20 years later, Britain is fighting another Second World War. So Priestley is saying this would never have happened if the upper classes had been rational and if they had learned the inspector's lesson. The upper classes, of course, are represented by the Burlings and Gerald, Eric and Sheila, and the fact that they appear to have learnt the lesson in 1912 is simply an illusion. When we get through to 1945, we find that that lesson was not actually learnt. And in Eric's case, it's because he does not take responsibility for his actions, and even when he seems to here, he's absolutely drunk when he does so. We can't believe anything he says. Now, there is another possibility here. So Eric also reflects the other possible future of young men from rich families in 1912. And that future was, of course, the First World War. Now, interestingly, Eric is a similar age to Priestley at the start of the First World War. And like Priestley, if he is lucky enough to survive, he will experience its full horrors. Priestley lived through the whole of the First World War and therefore wrote this play as an attack on the society that sent a whole generation of young men to war, with, I think, 1 in 10 soldiers losing their lives. So if he survives, the horrors of war have not been enough to change his behaviour. And Priestley is furious about this. He's saying, look, we've got this whole generation of upper class men who have come back from the First World War and have seen that horror, and even that has not been enough to stop them trying to exploit people and earn a profit out of their labour. In my other videos, you'll see how I've tried to show that the going to war is actually an economic move. So interestingly, in 1912, there are a huge number of labour strikes, and one of the ways of stopping the strikes and getting business back in business again was to actually go to war. Because then all the strikes stopped, all these workers then enlisted and decided to go off to war. All the businesses like Crofts and Burling's made a fortune. Remember, they're a clothing business. Well, what are you going to do with 7 million uniforms? All right, well, we'll have to make them from scratch. Who's going to make that money? Guess who? Crofts and Burling's, that sort of company. So the capitalists, the rich, made an enormous amount of money from the war. But there is another problem. The rich sent their sons off to war, obviously, but they were the officer class. That here are your officers. What happened to them? Well, they were the first out of the trenches, visibly leading their men bravely from the front, and actually they suffered even more than the ordinary soldier. So an interesting aspect of the First World War is the rich companies pursued war as a kind of aggressive form of capitalism because they'd make more profit, but what they sacrificed wasn't just their workers, it was also their sons. So this is another reason that Eric might not have learnt the inspector's lesson, or rather that learning would have made no difference, because actually so many of them, if they were socially responsible, couldn't change the future because they were killed in the war. Alternatively, if Eric survived the war, then he represents that upper class who should have embraced social responsibility and should have embraced socialist beliefs, according to Priestley, but they didn't. So, you've got to decide whether you think that Eric has in fact died in this future. If you do, then Eric has learned the lesson, but he cannot change the future because we imagine he gets killed in the First World War. Eric then becomes a symbol of the generation of upper class youth who have learned social responsibility through fighting in the war, but that lesson was lost because their lives were lost. In this interpretation, the older generation represented by the Burlings held on to power for far too long because too many of the youth who would normally replace them had died in the war. So the future didn't change because the people in power didn't change. So you can have either interpretation, either that Eric's killed in the war, or that Eric survives the war but just doesn't pay attention to the lessons. Which interpretation do I prefer? I'm going to go with this one. Remember I told you that Priestley went to war at the same age as Eric. Well, the difference with Priestley is that he came from a very normal background. His father was a teacher. He wasn't upper class, but at the end of the war, he went to Cambridge. This is the very education, the varsity education that Eric has had. And he would have seen firsthand this kind of drunken behaviour of the upper class men studying at Cambridge. And Eric represents them and represents Priestley's disgust at the sort of hedonism, that means pursuit of pleasure, the hedonism of these men. who didn't take social responsibility seriously in any way. But you don't have to agree with that. You can think, well, you know, perhaps Eric died in the war, because that is a tragic fate of many of these upper class men. But hopefully you'll now be able to argue about the way that he's traditionally presented, and then develop that by looking at how he doesn't accept responsibility, and we can argue that he doesn't really believe in the words that he espouses at the end of the play because he is drunk. You need to therefore say why Eric represents the upper class views. If you're just writing about Eric on his own, you won't get the top marks. You have to talk about how he represents capitalism as theft. If you do that, it's impossible not to get at least a grade 7. So, good luck with your revision. Thank you for subscribing. See you soon on my channel.